Well, it's not like we're, doing sweating with the oldies on this show or anything like that.
That would be a fantastic use for time.
It would be a fantastic use for time. Welcome back to Sermon Rewind. My name is Todd, and with me, whether he wants to be or not, is DJ Jazzy Jordan Hall.
Afternoon.
How you doing?
Doing fantastic. How about you?
I'm strictly adequate.
All right.
It's good to see you.
Yeah.
So we're still around the dinner table. Got a few more courses.
Yes, we do.
And this last week, you covered human sexuality. Again, multiple texts. And your big idea was the fracture of human sexuality is not repaired by redirecting one's urges, but by restoring one's soul.
Yeah.
Okay. So, before we get to your points, let me just ask you a generalized question, because when you started, you said, I can't remember the exact phraseology. This was like your scrubbed or sanitized or cleaned up version of your sermon.
Okay.
Right?
Lay it on me.
Sort of that you said something to that effect, right?
Yeah, since then I had to clean it up for the audience, sure.
You had to clean up for the audience.
Yeah.
I suppose I don't need a lot of details. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole with this. And I suppose I could ask this same question with this whole series, right? Categorically, what do you want to say to people when you say something like that? Like, what's the type of stuff, not necessarily, again, subject matter, but just sort of conceptually, that you sort of write something down and then you say, I don't know how well that's going to go, or maybe I shouldn't say that, or maybe I should say that differently. Give people a peek behind the curtain of sermon writing and maybe why you would say something like that.
Yeah, just because so much of human sexuality is, obviously pertaining to biological acts, particularly those with body fluids and sweat and all the things nobody wants to really hear about on a Sunday morning. So because it is uncouth in nature, there's a part of me that just says, well, let's try to glossy this up enough to where folks aren't immediately offended or turned off by the content, but are willing to kind of sit through long enough to hear what I believe is still very much a redemptive story. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So body fluids and sweat is okay on Wednesday night, but probably not on Sunday morning.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it on Sunday morning.
Okay, fantastic. Good to know. So in your first point, you said what was intended for human sexuality. And you were talking about the garden, Adam and Eve, running around, being who they are, doing their thing. Okay. I've asked you a similar question to this before, and this was actually something that someone sent to me in terms of, we're not given a ton of details, right? I mean, it's we get some description, but it's pretty abstract, and it's very distant from our own experience.
Which part exactly?
Well, in terms of, I would say most pertinently, the spiritual aspect of things, right? Pre-fall.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so it's good to unpack that and think that through and study that and say, okay, this is what God intended. But the fall happened, right?
Yeah.
And no matter how much we wish we could go back to that, sin has forever altered things. You talked a little bit later about how, people will always want. People will always let other people down. Even the happiest, most committed relationships are going to be dissatisfying on some level.
Yeah.
And we age and we decay and we just become, all this stuff. So what do we do with then that biblical narrative of the garden, of perfection, when we're not getting there, right? What do we do with that?
You mean when we're not going back to?
We're not going back to, right? Future, sure,
Yeah.
right? But even then, heaven is not, it's not going to look, at least scripture tells us, it's not going to look like recreating the garden.
Yeah, fair enough, and I agree. I think there is something to be said if, you said it right, the fall happened and it's always been the fall for us, right? You and I do not have any days of yore to look back to. We have only this. We have only this ugly, hurting, suffering, and ultimately, falling short of experiences. Particularly when it comes to sexuality, we have nothing for a framework. So if you read something or somebody tells you, hey, listen, there is a beautiful future, right? But you don't have any idea what that looks like. And in your scriptures, you don't have a super clear description of what the future looks like either. You have to go somewhere. You have to bring your head above the waves somehow. So going back to the story of the garden at least gives us enough to whet the palate. It at least gives us something to look at that says, wait, there is an expression of purity and joy and happiness and fulfillment when it comes to our humanity, let alone our sexuality. And while it may not ever go back to this in its entirety, there is enough here to at least sink our teeth into and say, if we're heading in this direction at all, then I'm all in. Does that make sense?
It does. So what do you say to somebody who hears that, and you were talking about, say, a couple's sex life, and you say this could be very, very good, right? What do you say to the couple who it's just kind of always been, their intimacy has always just kind of been there, right? There are couples that have professed that in their life, that it's just, or people that are older, and again, there's different ways to love, there's different love languages, there's different ways that people connect, right? What you're describing just sounds great to some people, but they kind of go, I don't feel like we have that wow factor necessarily. And again, we know that sort of the imagery of the world and romance and squadrons of jets and fireworks and all this stuff that's portrayed in, say, TV and movies and stuff like that is not necessarily real, right? So how does a couple suss out all of that when we're talking again about intention, right?
Well, far be it for me to act like I'm an intimacy guru by any stretch, right? I don't think I have it always figured out either. I said something in the sermon that I have, by virtue of my wife kind of putting on me from the beginning, I've lived by it ever since. And there is this sad misplacement of our highest expectations, right? And that's why the big mistake of always telling people to eagerly look forward to your marriage, because somehow in your marriage, everything's going to come together and work out to the best possible version of itself. That's such a farce, because it doesn't, right? I meant it when I said my wife is not enough for me, and I am not enough for her. And that doesn't mean that we picked the wrong partner. It means that we're both human beings, which means that our sexual intimacy, it's never going to be everything that my heart and soul longs for. That's why dumping not any of our energy, but dumping the majority of our energy into this hope of a full and healable and enjoyable in every respect sex life and biology is just, you're missing the mark. It belongs somewhere, but it can only be satisfied in one place. For the Christian, we recognize that all of our needs, all of our desires are met in Jesus. And when we're freed that way, we can enjoy intimacy with our spouse in an appropriate way, which is ultimately life-giving and doesn't leave any of us, feeling downcast and shamed.
So in your second point, you said, what has become of human sexuality? You reference, I should say, I can go back to point one. You talked about, again, Genesis 1, 27, 28, and then chapter 2, verse 24. In point two, you were talking about Romans 1, 21 to 27. And I'll just throw out a hypothesis of mine that with this series, there were people in that congregation that were waiting for you to address certain things.
Sure.
And they were that may have been their only concern. As long as you said yay or nay on a couple of things, that's what they're waiting for.
Yeah.
Right? So I want to give you an opportunity to sort of double down on something you talked about as you were talking about sort of the global look at that passage,
right? Because
people pick it apart a little bit. And I would say, do you feel like we, even in the church, rank sins? And do we, in this area, say, okay, I get it, Jordan, all of this is bad, right? All this is good, all this is bad, but at least I, or those people, don't do these things. The people that do these things are really bad, right? What do you say to somebody who would say, yeah, but I feel like these are, if they're honest, they put them higher on sort of the sin scale?
Of course they do. Yeah, and part of the reason they do that is because, we'll clarify, right? When you're looking at Romans chapter 1, that is without question the anchor text for whether or not there is any hope of a God-affirming, LGBTQ sexual intimacy and monogamy. That's where they go to. This text tells us very clearly, and sometimes very hard for us to hear, that there is not. There is a significant dilemma within the homosexual sexual lifestyle. That being said, that's not the only thing being spoken of in that text. But we live in a day and time where this is such a hyper-focused issue, especially in the church, right? There's so much attention here. It is just a boiling over cauldron of interest around whether or not a church is going to affirm something that Scripture seems to articulate as sinful or not. And so, yes, the big elephant in the room that you mentioned folks were looking for is that, and whether or not I was going to address the fact that that elephant was adorned in rainbow colors or not. The fact of the matter is, human sexuality has gone horribly awry, and while homosexual sexual intimacy is a significant reflection of that, it is by no means the only, or on a pecking order, at the top of the list. It is one of many ways in which human beings have just allowed themselves, as they forsake their Creator, to devour other people, to devour even themselves, on this constant road of trying to make sense of why they feel the way they feel. And yeah, it is not one or the other, it's all of it.
So you and I know that this again gets into a level of hypocrisy, because again, people single things out, right? Yeah. Whether you're a church, whether you're a denomination, that sort of thing, and we say, okay, we're going to discuss this particular thing, and we're going to make a statement about it, and that sort of thing, right? What is our role then as the church when there is, and again, we could expand this to a whole bunch of different stuff, and some of these again are other topics. But what do we do with that then, right? We know that sin is sin, right? Yeah. But we still end up calling out certain sins. Should we do that? Or should we try to say, look, let's not try to demonize one particular segment of the population, right? Let's talk about sin just in general. And let's talk about the fact that, hey, we condemn this, but if we're honest, we put up with this because it's more normal and it's more in our view of what we think is normal, right? This is our wheelhouse. How do we have that dialogue, sort of sussing out all that out?
You just have to be really honest, right? And I know that sounds super cliche, but the fact of the matter is, if you're talking about human sexuality, you could have anybody in the room with you, and they're automatically already thinking LGBTQ folks, right? They're not thinking about little Jimmy down the street who is an A+ student but watches porn every night before he goes to bed. Like these two don't live in the same world, which sadly means that Jimmy is going to end up growing up into a probably pretty messed up adult with a really horrifyingly bad theology of sexuality, a really terrible way of seeing women, and a really awful way of sort of evaluating how he needs ultimately, if he ever does get married, how he needs to sort of, walk out of sexuality with his spouse. But we're not going to pay any attention to that because what we're most focused on is how do we protect our kids and our neighbors from the gay guy who lives down the street, right? What if he hangs a flag on his front doorstep? Good God, what are we going to do? I'm not saying that we shouldn't address our neighbors and our friends who likewise have this kind of sin embroiled in their life. We should. That doesn't mean turn blind eye to anything. But you have to talk about sexuality within the contents of that spectrum. You have to. Because if you don't, you focus so much on one thing that, the whole ship goes down behind you and you don't even realize it. And so you just have to be honest. You just have to say, no, you know what? Let's talk about this particular thing, but let's talk about all of it while we're at it. Which means let's put this, the spotlight on you and I as well. Let's not just talk in the abstract about people out there. Let's talk about the way this affects Todd and the way this affects Jordan too. And let's not pretend like we're somehow above it because we happen to be attracted to the opposite sex and we married in the church, and that all of a sudden means, like I said before, that there's no problems left. We know that's not true. So let's talk about sexuality broadly and honestly, and let's sweep through the caverns of our own hearts too. You know what I mean?
I do.
Yeah.
So in your third point, you said what can restore sexuality to its rightful state? With a caveat, of course, in that we're not going to redeem the world. We're not going to overcome sin, right?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a question that I get from people sometimes because, and I understand from your standpoint, you don't want to just turn everything into a checklist, right? Because then it becomes legalistic. Then it just becomes, well, as long as I'm doing X, Y, and Z, then I'm meeting the thing. It's more conceptual.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
And ultimately you got to an end, which you've gotten to on a number of these issues. This is a spiritual issue.
Mm-hmm.
This is a much bigger issue than, again, human relationships, right? This is between you and God. What's going on between you and God, right? And you said, don't necessarily get distracted with, and this was in your big idea, redirecting, right? Hobbies and, whatever, timers and checklists and accountability partners and that sort of thing. But some people are going to look at this, and you did blitz through some tools at the end, right? Some people are going to say, okay, Jordan, I get it. Yes, it's about Jesus. It's about us and Jesus. If I get up every day and I deal with this thing, and maybe I do pray, maybe I do ask God, like the Apostle Paul, take this away, and God doesn't seem to, right?
Yeah.
So what do you want to tell people practically, right? Because there is still mechanisms in place. There are still spiritual disciplines where you go, look, I'm not just going to say, hey, just you and God figure it out. You're going to give people some steps.
Yeah.
Right? What does that look like? Maybe in this issue or maybe in the church in general?
Yeah. There's two things. I'll just take a little bit of time. There's two things to focus on with that. And the reason why I want to double down on this statement is because I still think even in the church, we miss it. And as a result of missing it, we don't spend nearly enough of our energy and life pursuing it. When I say that sort of broadly, the answer is in Jesus, I mean that. What I don't mean by that is that you just say, okay, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed and nothing happened. So either A, this doesn't work, or B, he doesn't like me very much, right? One of those two things. You use Paul in the perfect example, right? Paul had a thing, whatever that thing
Whatever
was.
the thing was.
And he prayed 3 times and Jesus said, no, my power is made perfect for you in your weakness. The way Paul endures through that is first because he is willing to accept that my lot in life may be that all I have is Christ. When he says in Philippians that I've learned how to rise above, so to speak. I've learned how to be content no matter what's happening, plenty and in want. I've learned the secret. The secret isn't that there's a certain amount of disciplines, right? Or that he prays this amount of times, or that he has an end date for his suffering. No, it is about the fact that he grows wildly comfortable with just being in Christ, and Christ being enough for him. And I know we can romanticize that a little bit, but Christians have a tendency to over-compartmentalize. Well, okay, I sought Jesus, I did my devotions, I prayed my prayers, and nothing changed. What if just being with Jesus for the rest of your life, what if that's all the reprieve you ever get? Can you be content with that? That's the big question. So number one, when I say it is about you and Jesus, I mean it is about Jesus taking the person to the end of the rope and saying, can we just be here? If this is all you ever get, can my power be enough for you? Can my life be enough for you? Can your relationship with me, can you orbit around me as the sun? Can that work? And when the Christian gets to the place where they say, by God's grace, I can be content here, then I mean this. If there's deliverance in this life or not, it doesn't matter as much. I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all. I'm just saying they can handle it. I've met many individuals who are like, I chose a celibate life because all of my heart and soul is satisfied in Jesus. Doesn't mean I don't struggle at times. Doesn't mean I don't need things, but I have enough in him, and I've learned kind of the secret to contentment as a result. So like I said, first things first, it has to be about Jesus. You got to find yourself rooted in Jesus. You got to throw all of your life at him as if he is all that you need. And then second to that, those practical steps that I talked about, I think they're really important. It's a continual fight, and it will be a continual fight for as long as God chooses to tarry in this area with you. So for some, it's going to be kind of owning that there is a disordered mess in my life. Like every day you got to get up and you got to accept the fact that I am primed in such a way and I don't know why, but it is in me in compulsion to do some things that I know are not good for me, right? My sexuality is disordered. So I'm going to own that. I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to make excuses. And I'm certainly not going to lie to myself and say, you know what, I'm just going to come to a place where this is my new identity. It's how I feel. I'm just going to accept it. I'm just going to give myself over to it, because that becomes increasingly problematic, as we discussed on Sunday, right? So it's owning the fact that we are a disordered mess. It's also owning the fact that Jesus forgives and forgives and forgives and forgives and forgives. And as much as we are in the fight, stumbling, falling, getting back up again by his strength, he will forgive, he will be with us, he will remain with us, and he will not leave us. And then lastly, set your hope on things to come. I don't know what that looks like for everybody. Heck, I don't even know what that looks like for me half the time. But I'm so convinced that he who shepherds us and he who walks with us is good and will make right on his promises, that I'm signing up to live that life, right? For however long it takes. So that's kind of the deeply spiritual reality and the practical implications of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks again for joining us on Sermon Rewind. We want to hear from you. Comments, questions, disagreements, drop them on YouTube. And if you're in the area, come by on Wednesday nights. We will have dinner at 5:45. We meet at 6:30, talk about these topics. There will be some questions, new people to meet. And thanks again for joining us on Sermon Rewind.
See you soon.